Hello, everyone. So, the second topic this week is housing. So, in talking about housing, I'm going to give just a little bit of background. We're going to talk about the housing investment externality, a little bit on gentrification, and then a longer discussion on housing affordability. So, just for some background, housing has been a problem since the beginnings of capitalism. Way back in kind of the history of early capitalism in Great Britain, you had peasants that needed to be displaced from their land in order to create an incentive for them to work for wages. So in this way, the establishment of kind of a market for housing came hand in hand with the establishment of a market for labor. Also kind of harkening back to kind of early political economy, density of housing has immense positive consequences for development. Thinking kind of in Smithian terms, the extent of the market is increased, right? Because you got more people in closer proximity, so more transactions can happen. And so if the extent of the market increases, that means that we can all specialize more and become more productive. And this is why cities were and continue to be so important for economic development, is when people are put together in cities, they can specialize, but also they can form networks and connections that help increase the rate of economic transactions. And just to kind of give you an idea of what housing looks like in the U.S., just very broad, 64.2% of U.S. households own their homes, which leaves 35.8% who are renting. So, let's talk some theory. An individual's investment in their own home doesn't just generate benefits for them. It generates benefits for those that are around them. And this is, we call a positive externality, right? An effect of an economic transaction that occurs to someone, or that the effect of an economic transaction that does not affect the two contracting parties. So, for instance, I decide to paint my house, which means the value of my neighbor's house goes up because they now live in a nicer looking neighborhood, right? And a lack of housing investment could lead to a negative externality, right? I let my lawn grow up and then all my neighbors' housing values go down because the neighborhood looks less nice. And so this is kind of this idea of the housing externality. Everyone's actions affects the value of everyone around them, the value of the homes around them. But we can also think about it in terms of the value of housing services. So it's not just that the market value of their homes may change, but also their experienced utility generated from living in their home may change too, right? If like the neighborhood looks less nice or becomes less safe or whatever. Some of you may be familiar with the Coase theorem. The Coase theorem states that if trade in an externality is possible and there are no transaction costs, bargaining will lead to efficient outcomes regardless of the initial allocation of property rights. And so this is often cited in kind of environmental economics literature of, well, if we can just create something called individual transferable quotas, for instance, on like fishery harvesting, then all of the fishermen in that market will trade those quotas around. Those quotas will end up being given to the people that can bring those fish to market at lowest possible cost because they will be the most profitable, and they will be able to pay the highest price for the quota. So it diverts things towards their most efficient use. But with this housing externality, transaction costs aren't zero. They're somewhat more than zero, right? So Coase's theorem really doesn't apply. And so how do communities actually deal with this? Well, they create regulations. Cities or neighborhoods regulate housing externalities by placing specific restrictions or responsibilities on homeowners. This is why the city cites people that let their lawns go. This is why HOAs prevent people from parking in the street or whatever, right? So these are all ways that people have kind of created these bureaucratic systems to restrict the actions of others to protect their own housing values or stream of housing services. But often, these regulations can have the consequence of excluding poor residents or other unintended consequences. For instance, in the small town that I lived in before moving to Salt Lake, the city council passed a rule saying we weren't going to issue a building permit to anyone that didn't have a concrete driveway. And so if you needed a building permit but you had a gravel driveway, you would have to, as part of that building permit application, commit to pouring a new driveway. But this had the unintended consequence of preventing many poorer people in the city from actually upkeeping their homes because they couldn't get building permits to do the work legally because pouring a concrete driveway was prohibitively expensive for them. So this is just something to keep in mind, is that these regulations have consequences that affect people who have kind of maybe limited ability to pay. Another important aspect of this housing externality is that it spreads over a distance, right? So it affects houses around it, maybe houses one street over, but it probably doesn't affect the value of houses or the value of housing services halfway across a city. Studies have found that this effect decays with distance and extends out to anywhere between 200 to 1,000 feet, depending on kind of the specifics of the surrounding. If there's a lot of densely packed streets, maybe it spreads less. If there's a lot of physical barriers, maybe it spreads less. But the size of the externality and the distance over which it decays is an important variable for policymakers who may be engaging in public investment in housing or providing some sort of subsidy or penalty to encourage or discourage specific sorts of behavior. But this stuff is really difficult to estimate because houses don't get houses in a specific neighborhood, for instance, there aren't buying and selling happening there every day. It takes a long time for those transactions to go, so we have to estimate them over a long period of time, and so other things can change in the meantime, and so it's difficult to just isolate the effect purely of housing investment. But another important aspect of this is whether housing investments complement each other or substitute for each other. So if your neighbor invests in their house and that makes it to where you gain more value from investing in your house, and so you increase your investment as well, then that suggests that housing investment is a complement. It's a complementary good, just like, shoes and socks. If you buy more of one, you probably buy more of the other. And this, in kind of game theoretical terms, becomes a coordination game with two stable equilibrium. Either all invest or all not invest, and both of these equilibrium can be stuck. And so if housing investment is complementary, this kind of gives us a story that explains why there are kind of neighborhoods with high levels of investment and neighborhoods with low levels of investment. But there's also kind of the ability to pay factor that's working in the background that kind of confounds this whole model. The other option is if housing investment is a substitute. So if your neighbor invests, that makes it less likely for you to invest. So in that case, it becomes a prisoner's dilemma with one equilibrium, no investment. And so that maybe in some markets, in some instances, it's a substitute. But we can see that, universally, it's not a substitute because there are areas where investment occurs, even absent some sort of HOA or city regulation. And each of these implies a different policy response. So, for instance, if housing investment is a substitute, then this kind of strategic form of it indicates a market failure. And so that creates a avenue for cities and states to step in to regulate or to invest themselves. So anyway, moving away from kind of that theoretical realm to something a little closer to reality, let's talk about gentrification. So in its strictest sense, gentrification is a process of renovation of deteriorated urban neighborhoods by means of the influx of more affluent residents. So basically, richer people move in, and in the process of them moving in, that increases investment in that neighborhood, and there's some process of redevelopment. This can happen in a few different ways. The most kind of prominent one that we usually think of is affluent residents displace existing residents. So people move in, they invest, rent increases, and then the existing residents typically have to find different places to live because they now have been priced out of their homes. So, but there are other ways that gentrification can occur. For instance, higher income housing can be constructed on unused or low-value non-residential land. So this is kind of like land that wasn't being used anyway. And if that happens, then there's less of a chance of affluent resident influx displacing the existing residents because the original lower income housing stock still remains there. You can also have, in the strictest sense, a type of gentrification where just the incomes of the existing residents increases. So for instance, say a new factory moves in that pays good wages, people start working there, then maybe the old neighborhood gentrifies a bit. It can also occur because lower income residents leave for normal reasons, though this would seem to be less common. So the point here, though, is that gentrification does not necessarily mean displacement. It's also important to note that gentrification isn't necessarily universally bad or good, right? So it does increase. So a lot of research shows that for those residents that remain in the neighborhood after it has become gentrified, their incomes increase, and not by a small amount, by a pretty substantial amount. There's also some suggestion that gentrified neighborhoods, that residents may actually move less once it is gentrified. So even the low-income residents in those neighborhoods that were there previously now may be more stable in the new higher income thing if they were able to remain. So they can still stay despite increasing rent because their incomes have also increased. So to gentrification, there really isn't a simple answer because development is nice. It increases incomes, but also it can displace existing residents under certain conditions. So planners need to keep in mind that if they're building new high-income housing, where that housing is built and what it's displacing. Is it on unused land? Is it on low-value commercial land? Or are we eliminating low-cost units for high-cost units? And also, kind of as a theme that keeps popping up in this course, this is clearly an issue where there are some losers. And so especially whenever there's some policy that is kind of pushing for gentrification of a specific region, there should also probably be some sort of policy in place to compensate the losers in this situation, the people that are displaced. It's also impossible to ignore the fact that gentrification has a large racial component because communities that are mostly minority tend to get disproportionately targeted because they are also disproportionately low income. And the policy decisions about what does and doesn't receive investment is highly racialized in the U.S. and in the past, but we still deal with the consequences of it today. For instance, thinking back to our discussion on redlining, for instance, where the historic policy of redlining created the highly segregated, or the somewhat segregated or highly segregated, depending on the city, communities of today. But the same risk assessment policies continue today, just with a less overt character, or less overtly racist character. But the effect may be similar. And so this is kind of like, we still live with the consequences of these laws. And so anyway, digging back into the past a bit, Federal Housing Administration policy was to guarantee mortgages in developments for whites and not developments for blacks. And this is very explicit historical evidence of developers going to get FHA guarantees for developments for black Americans, and the FHA said no. But also HUD, the Department for Housing and Urban Development, in its kind of early years, it, as a concession to Southern senators in order to kind of get the bill that would create public housing passed, it essentially agreed to segregate public housing. And so there were public housing units created for black Americans and public housing units created for white Americans. And it just so happened that many years later, whenever urban renewal was occurring, it tended to target those public housing developments that were made for black Americans. There's a very sad story about St. Louis, where there was a big development project. They were going to build the St. Louis Arch. They were going to expand the highway system to kind of allow the suburbs to pour into the city. They were going to expand a university, and all of this was taking chunks out of this neighborhood that had a lot of public housing for black Americans. And so the residents of this kind of block in St. Louis were compensated in a way. They were given rent vouchers that would pay fair market rent for apartments anywhere in the city. But quickly after these vouchers became available, St. Louis is this weird patchwork of many, many different small municipalities. It's incredibly strange. But each of these tiny municipalities started passing laws against the use of these rent vouchers, so they were banned. And so this is how you ended up with communities like Ferguson near St. Louis that ended up being predominantly black when it was predominantly white before, because it was one of the few communities that allowed the use of those rent vouchers. And so there's this kind of policy that created this racial crowding that still persists today. And so this is another aspect of urban development policy that needs to be thought of whenever, any investment decision or regulation is being considered. So let's kind of step back from that and talk about more broadly why housing isn't affordable in the U.S. So, framing the problem, a full-time minimum wage worker cannot afford a 2-bedroom apartment in any county in the U.S. without being cost burdened, which by the government is defined as spending 30% or more of income on rent. Housing prices are growing at twice the rate of wage growth, and rent is growing faster than wages as well. Economic laws would suggest that if we have this kind of high demand for housing, the prices are high, this creates a lot of opportunities for firms to profit. So why is the housing supply not expanding in response to high prices? So there are a few things going on. The federal government favors homeowners over renters. And this has the consequence that many more single-family units are built than multifamily units, which are, less multifamily units being more space efficient and lower cost. The largest federal housing expense is the mortgage interest tax deduction. So essentially, people get a tax deduction based on the interest that they pay on mortgage payments. And this disproportionately goes to the middle and upper end of the income distribution because poor people rent. So going from that kind of policy side to the public housing side, Housing and Urban Development's rental assistance program has been continually cut, and there hasn't been an increase in the number of federally available public units since the 1980s. So they've just been redeveloping and maintaining the stock, but population has clearly increased in that time. So another issue is restrictive land use regulations. This in the reading I had you look at, this is under the title of the NIMBYs, the Not in My Backyards. And so this is policies by neighborhoods, cities, to not allow multifamily units in some areas. This keeps the housing stock down, which has dual points here. One, it's keeping the housing stock down, but it's also keeping prices higher, which benefits people that already own property. And furthermore, there's also often local political resistance by entrenched local powers against public units, because once again, they want to protect the value of their own homes. Transportation is also an issue. So most jobs are going to be in urban centers, but increasing prices push low and middle income people further and further away from these jobs, and transportation costs can end up being pretty high for these people, especially if public transit isn't available. And so if we kind of think of this less as like a pure housing problem, more as like a housing and access to jobs problems, we need to be thinking about these transportation costs too. Because if we can basically make transportation costs cheaper, then we can functionally spread people out further. And this would be especially beneficial if, say, that further spreading out also included more multifamily units. In addition, something else that is probably less important than the other points we've talked about is speculation. So vacant units that are just being held in the hopes that they're going to increase in value in the future are functionally removed from the housing stock for a time. And so there's some evidence that this speculation increased housing prices substantially in the lead up to the 2008 recession, and possibly made the recession worse, but also it likely had some sort of effect on the availability of housing. So, wrapping things up, investment in housing has spillover effects that create motives for regulation. Our policy response should depend upon whether housing investment is a substitute or a complement. It seems like it's probably complementary, but difficult to say. Gentrification has both positive and negative aspects, and intervention could offset some of the downsides, but we also need to think about kind of our own history and equity. Housing policy has been highly racialized in the U.S. and has resulted in discrimination being built into this physical environment, with kind of crowding of Black Americans into specific areas by and large. This is going to be different in every city because, unlike many of the other things we talked about, housing is largely managed at a local city or county level. It's very local, but there's these kind of big commonalities across localities in the U.S. And finally, there are significant barriers to providing affordable housing in the U.S., but there are some policy responses that we could look at. For instance, maybe taxes on vacant units, or reducing the restrictive regulations that prevent the construction of multifamily units, increased funding of public transportation, those sorts of things. Maybe more support for renters at the federal level, or maybe even having a national or state level housing policies rather than keeping this patchwork of local city, neighborhood, and county policies. Anyway, that's all I got on this, so I will see you next week.